I don't think I've ever had an introduction quite like that. Thank you very much, Joe. I especially have to thank you and Esther for bringing this together, bringing all you beautiful people in Great Falls into this one building, representing 22 different efforts and groups working for a better world. This really, to me, represents the ideal of what I'm trying to do on my peace tour, is to stimulate people to work together and to communicate with one another and to find out our commonality. Even though we may be focusing on different particular issues, we can still see that there's a larger picture that we're all working to make a better world and a better life for our children and our grandchildren. I come to you tonight with hope and a message and a vision. And I'm sure most of you are pretty aware of the problems that we face. We hear about it in the news, and we see it on TV, and we talk about it. And for the last 6.5 years, it's been a very depressing and a time of despair for many people to see the direction that our country has gone in. Although some people have wanted to go in that direction, I think there's a lot of us who have become extremely concerned that it's moving in a very dangerous direction, in a short-sighted view of what's going on, and that there's going to be maybe some serious long-term consequences of some of the policies that we've seen put into practice in the last few years. But I don't want to focus too long on the negative side, because I think you're all pretty aware of that, and I want to go into a vision of how the world could be at peace and a world of justice, and then into the practical steps that I see that we can take to get from where we are now to that more ideal situation. But it might be helpful just to look at maybe some of the aspects and some of the symptoms, really, of the problems that we are dealing with, just to get a sense of it. And so I'd like to ask you to just, follow what I'm saying and visualize yourself what I'm talking about, and think along with me, and you may see different examples or different issues that are of concern to you. And let's take some time here to just really experience deep within ourselves and in our hearts what is the state of the world now in 1987. We look at a planet with about 5 billion people living on it, and I suppose there's about a great percentage of those people who don't have enough to eat. There's maybe 15 to 20 million people dying of starvation every year. And sometimes we forget that. 40,000 people a day, 3/4 of them children. We think that, 6 million people died in the Holocaust and how terrible that was. And yet we have a Holocaust every 3 or 4 months in the world. And for lack of clean water supply, people are dying in third world countries. And yet at the same time, we in the prosperous nations are spending well over $2 billion a day on military expenses. The United States spends already $300 billion a year, almost $1 billion a day, to make more weapons and missiles and guns and tanks, and to pay soldiers to be stationed all around the world. And yet analysis has shown that only 3% of that national defense budget goes to defend the borders of the United States. And so we look at and we ask ourselves, why is this going on? And if we look at the psychology of the people in the United States and the things that the politicians say and what we hear the people say in the media about this great threat, the Soviet Union, and how the Soviet Union is trying to take over the world. And if we were to go over to the Soviet Union, we might see the same kind of propaganda turned the other way, where there's this capitalist nations in the West that according to Lenin's theory, are innately expansionistic because capitalism always has to expand into greater markets and further resources. And so they feel a great threat from the imperialistic powers of the West, and they've been attacked from the West before, and so they feel that they have to defend themselves against the threat, and they feel very insecure, and they've got to have this ring of countries around them in Eastern Europe, and they can't lose control over a country like Afghanistan because it's right on their southern border. And so I'm sure none of us are saying that their policies necessarily are right or any better than ours, but I think it's helpful if we put ourselves in their shoes and we feel, the concerns that they have. We find a world in which the industrialized nations, the United States, Western Europe, and Japan primarily, have, for example, about 20% of the population, and yet are using some 80% of the world's resources. The population of the United States is now less than 5% of the world, and we're using a third of the world's resources. And so the question arises, how long can this go on? And, what's going to happen with the debt crisis? The Latin American debt crisis, for example, is not only has been described as a third world war in Latin America, where instead of soldiers being killed and industry being destroyed, we find children are dying and schools and hospitals are being cut back or destroyed. And yet it's ironic because the pressures that are put on the Latin American countries to pay back the debt to the banks, the capitalists who have loaned the money to them at very high interest rates, prevents them from importing goods from the United States. And so then that hurts the economy of the United States. And of course, when we see how many people of our resources, our scientists and engineers are working for the military, over half, and it's not really doing anything to our quality of life. And of course, we've been financing this whole thing by borrowing from our children. We haven't even bothered to tax ourselves to pay for all this military buildup. And so, in one sense, when we look at this world, we can see, gosh, this looks kind of dismal, looks kind of sad. And many people I've talked to, I get the feeling are rather discouraged. It's like they see a better way, and yet trying to change the policies of this government under the Reagan administration has been like beating their heads against the wall. And some people have even, gotten tired and have given up. But I see a different picture. And what I would like maybe for us to do now is to visualize for a moment what kind of a world we could have and see what the possibilities are. And it's really quite simple, it seems to me, when we come down to the basic fundamentals of what everybody needs and would like to have for a good life. We start with simple, clean water to drink. Everyone wants clean water to drink, right? Clean air to breathe. We'd all like to be able to have enough food to eat. We'd all like to have a job security so that we can take care of our family and have security in our old age. And if we really care about other people, if we are concerned about the message of the Christ, to love others as ourselves, even to love our enemies, then we would want that for other people too, not just for our own self, our own family, or even for our own nation, our own society. I think we'd like to see a world in which everyone had education and had the potential to reach their potential and develop themselves and their abilities and become aware of the many interesting concerns of humanity in this time of crisis. So when we look at the world and the humanity that we're living on this planet, I think it's pretty easy to see that there's really no external threat to ourselves other than our own human beings, our own species. We're not endangered by any wild animals or horrible diseases or invasion from outer space. We're our own worst enemy. So the only threat that we really face is from each other. And so it's really a unique situation. And the way I see it, it's like, I call it an evolutionary crisis. It's a crisis of survival. If you understand, theory of evolution, natural selection, it's the species which are able to adapt and to survive, to pass on their genes, so the ones that reproduce, and continue on. And those species that are not able to adapt often die out. Now, it's been said by many scientists, and it's probably not too difficult for us to see, that if we had a nuclear war, there would be a possibility of the extinction of the human race. That is a definite possibility. And so we're in a situation facing this crisis of whether we're going to live or die. Not only our own personal lives, because we're all going to die in this physical body, but whether our children and their children and the species, the human race, human civilization is going to go on at all. It seems to me that this crisis is reaching such a crescendo now, and will be towards the culmination of this century, that our generation, the next 20, 30, 40 years, will see the results of the fate of the earth. And it's up to us. I believe that we all have free choice, free will, that we are an extension of God, and that as extensions of God we are creative, we are creators, but that we are responsible for our creations. And there's no guarantees, because we're given these choices. What I do believe is that we are eternal beings. And so we could never kill a soul. We could never destroy our own souls. There's no problem there. And I think that's, when one realizes that, there's a great inner joy and a sense of inner peace and contentment and an inner strength that can come out of that when you realize your own immortality. But when we experience the oneness with other beings, and when we move into our hearts and then with that love flow out and feel one with other people and love the creation as well as the Creator, then we see that we're in a limited world, one planet going around the sun in one part of the universe, and that this is our home while we're here. This is our school, really, where we learn to be responsible for our creations. And it's up to us to take care of it, because, if we make a mess out of it, there's really nowhere else to go. It's going to be rather difficult to try to live on Venus and Mars if we blow up the Earth. So we have a great concern, and we have a great challenge. If you think about all the heroic legends and myths and fairy tales and stories of heroes going out and slaying dragons or fighting evil, it seems to me that we have really a tremendous opportunity in our own times for great heroism. What could be a greater challenge than to save the human race from nuclear annihilation? There's a line from a George Harrison song that I like. He says, we better save the world because somebody else might want to use it. And this is something that we can all participate in, and actually is something that we are all collectively responsible for. And particularly in a democracy, or a society in which purports itself to be a democracy and does allow some opportunities to influence the governmental policies, we have a special responsibility. And in my new book, Life as a Whole, in the chapter on politics, I talk about how our influence in a democracy is proportional to our participation. In other words, if we want to have more of an influence, then we need to participate more in the process. And we also have a tremendous responsibility because we happen to live in one of the superpower nations. And in many ways, we are collectively responsible for what's going on in many parts of the world, for good or for ill. And so we have an opportunity as citizens of the United States to have a particularly important influence in the future destiny of the human race. And I'd like to talk now then about how we can make this kind of a transition to a world of peace and justice. Let me first, I guess, draw out a little more for you what a world of peace and justice would look like. We talked about the basic essentials, food and water and education, health care. I think we'd all agree that everyone deserves good health care. How then will such a world not going too far ahead where people are like angels and everybody is completely enlightened and doing the right thing automatically. Let's maybe not go quite that far. Let's just see if we can go to a world that would be free of, warfare and fascism and terrible kinds of oppression of human rights within countries. How would such a society then settle its differences? Because there's always going to be some differences of opinions and quarrels over different things. And it seems to me that we're in a kind of a social and spiritual evolution, and that we've developed from families into clans and tribes in which leaders were dominant, and these tribes would kind of group together and defend themselves against other tribes. And then with the development of agriculture, there was cities, and city-states were developed, and they would have their own means of defense against other city-states. And they might unify different tribes. Such as in Athens, there was like 10 different demes or tribal groups that made up the city. And so we had a larger political unit that was developed. And once that political unit is fairly well established, it's much more difficult and very rare to have violent confrontations between the elements within that division. And from the development of city-states, then there was, of course, the nations developed. And there were unified many different provinces and cities, and sometimes included different cultural and ethnic and language groups together. And once there was this sense of a people as a nation and laws of the nation, and the principle of law, I think, is a very fundamental one that we can use to settle our differences and to find a process of justice. And so what developed then was a system of jurisprudence, or the concept of law, which is where people would make laws. It might be democratic, it might be monarchical, it was for a while. And these laws were intended to be the same for everyone. And this is the idea, of course, in a democratic society. But pretty much the idea of the rule of law is that no person is above the law, that it's based on the principle of equality, and that as souls, the way I see it, we are all equally divine. We're all equally a part of God. No soul is better than another soul. And so, in this course, comes down to love your neighbor as yourself, which, by the way, implies that you love yourself. And that's the first place to start, because we don't really have much love to give to anyone else if we're not loving ourselves. So we developed this idea of law, and then we have try to appoint neutral judges, or we might have a system of a jury of people who would then decide a case objectively and would settle a dispute without having a battle over it, or to see who was the strongest, or who could handle a sword better, or shoot a gun more accurately. Or in more modern times, we developed, which country could develop the largest amounts of weapons manufacturing and largest numbers of soldiers and troops, et cetera, et cetera. So we developed the nation-state system. And once you have the nation-state system, there are some exceptions where you have civil wars and difficulties, but for the most part, if you look at the history of the United States, for example, and the development of the federal government and the Constitution of the United States, which we're celebrating now the 200th anniversary, the Constitutional Convention was held in the summer of 1787. So you had a situation, you had 13 colonies that broke off and became independent from England, and they set up a kind of Articles of Confederation, and it wasn't really working too well because they were kind of all squabbling with each other, and they all had their own separate little militias, and they had their separate money system and tariffs going over the borders and all these different things, and it wasn't really a unified people. It was like 13 separate states, and states in those days, meant nations. So finally, some intelligent, brilliant people got together and exercised some leadership and said, let's find a better way. Let's go into a larger concept here. We work together to get rid of the British. Why don't we work together to have a good society? And so they drew up this constitution in which the principle of federalism was put into practice. And not only the principle of federalism, but the principle of the separation of powers of the three branches of government, which they drew from a French philosopher by the name of Montesquieu. So the idea here was that if they felt that there was a danger, of course, of having a king. Nobody wanted a king because that's what they had had trouble with before because there had been the war with the French, and then they had to tax the colonies to pay for the war, and the people didn't want to pay the taxes, and so that's what caused the squabbles between England and the United States. Sound familiar? Anyway, so they didn't want to have a king, and they wanted to have a lot of freedom, and they wanted to have a protection of human rights. And so what they came up with was a kind of, well, let's kind of share the power around. Let's not put all the power in one place. Let's give some power to Congress to make laws, but not to enforce them, okay, and not to judge them, but just to make them, okay? And then we'll have a president and an executive branch that's responsible for enforcing the laws. An attorney general is like a prosecuting attorney, and he'll bring these people into court and make sure they have to face the judge. But we don't want to have the same person enforcing it as is judging it. So let's have some other group of people, namely the judges, deciding the question of the facts and the interpretation of the law. And so you have what's, as you all know from your civics lessons, I'm sure, this system of checks and balances. And, of course, there was a tremendous amount of trust for the person of George Washington, who had exhibited great leadership. And so they did give the president a lot of power because they trusted him. So we have this kind of system, and the nation then grew and developed and expanded across the continent, and you know that. But now we've gotten into a situation where we have these tremendously powerful nations, okay, with these military establishments which boggle the mind in comparison to anything previous in history. And just to give you an idea, to maybe bring this down to a personal level, I've done some calculating, and the weaponry is measured in terms of the equivalent tons of dynamite explosions. Used to think of a stick of dynamite, it's pretty powerful, cause a pretty big bomb explosion. And, that didn't weigh very much. Okay, so they call it in tons of dynamite now. And the atomic bombs were like, in Nagasaki and Hiroshima were about 13, 15 kilotons. That's thousands of tons of the dynamite equivalent. And then when they developed the hydrogen bombs, there was they measured them in megatons. Okay, this is millions of tons. They're like 1,000 times more powerful than what happened to Hiroshima. Now, if you take all the megatonnage in the United States arsenal today and divide it by the number of people in our country that it's supposedly defending, okay, and parcel it out to every person, we each would have the equivalent of about 35 tons of dynamite, okay? So think about that, having 35 tons of dynamite in your closet to protect yourself. Seems a bit much, doesn't it? So this is the situation we've got ourselves into. The biggest military buildup in the history of the world by far. I mean, there's just nothing in comparison. So what I see, based on my studies and my research into not only the great founders of the religions, and St. Francis is one of my favorites. I have a section in my book about him. And the great philosophers of peace throughout history from many different cultures, and the modern movements and the efforts towards world peace, particularly the League of Nations and the United Nations, I've tried to come up with an understanding of what kind of a system or what kind of ideas these great minds have put together that might be a workable way that we could solve some of these tremendous problems that we're facing. And it seems to me that there's this political evolution towards a larger sense of unity. But we've gotten stuck on this nationalistic level, okay, where we see the nation as the major unit of power. And we have these two semi-worldwide alliances, the communist nations, which actually is not all the communist nations because China's not even allied with the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union and their orbit of nations, and then the so-called free world, the capitalist world, the United States and Western Europe, and the NATO powers. So you have this situation of these two huge powers. Now, it seems to me that we need to, if we're going to solve this problem without having the possibility or the probability, is the rate we're going, there's always a mathematical probability, even by some sort of error or fluke, of having nuclear war. So it's very dangerous. The further along we go, with Pershing missiles can hit Moscow in 6 minutes. We're 6 minutes away from a nuclear war all the time now. It's a rather precarious situation. So there's a probability that if we go on the way we are, there'll be a nuclear war. And of course, no one wants that. And the other thing is that all of the other countries in the world just about are drawn into this kind of a battle. So whenever there's any instability in some third world country, the people, you start to fight against the government, and they may get help from one side or the other depending on which side is supporting the government. And so you end up with all these civil wars and arms coming in from each side and people getting killed in these various countries because the superpowers can't fight with each other, and besides, they don't want their people getting killed, so let the other people fight it out. And so it's really a terrible situation. So it seems to me that we need to redistribute this power and take this ultimate step for the human race and the planet Earth of coming into a unity. I call it a kind of political yoga. Yoga, means uniting together or integrating into a oneness. And so part of the vision that I hold out to people is a world in which we've gotten rid of all these nuclear weapons, all the chemical weapons, all the biological weapons, and we've reduced the conventional weapons down practically to like local police, okay? Now just catch the vision for a moment, and then I'll go into how we're going to get there, okay? So if we could have a world like this, and if we had a democratic, federal world government in which some powers were given to this world authority with 3 different branches distributed out. So you have some people elected to make the laws, you have some people elected, and probably not just one president, but let's say a council. Like I suggest the idea of like 9 representing like different continents, for example, in India and China. And then they would vote to, enforce the law. And then you'd have some other people, like judges, deciding the law, so that if there's any dispute between nations, they wouldn't fight it out by who has the strongest army, or who's got the best weapons, or who's got the biggest military-industrial complex to make the other side say, okay, we've got to give in because you're richer and more powerful than we are, not because you're right, but just because you're the bully. But not for those reasons, but based on equality, based on what's just, based on what's fair. At the same time, this could protect human rights throughout the world so that no government or no person would have their rights taken away from them. Rights that we all generally agree on in our society and really, in fact, throughout the world. Rights such as are described in the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights of the United Nations. So, to do this, it would have to be very carefully done because, first of all, the historical pattern of the League of Nations and the United Nations is that they've been too weak. In other words, they're not effective. They haven't been able to prevent wars because the nations haven't given up their power, they haven't given up their armies, and so while these agencies have attempted to do some good things around the world and are to be commended for that, they haven't been given sufficient power to prevent wars. Like there's 40 wars going on around the world right now in different countries. But the fear, on the other hand, that people have is that some sort of world government is going to be terrible. It's going to be a tyrant. It's going to tell us what to do. We don't like that. We want to be free. That's Satan, or that's horrible. Don't even say it. And this is a real concern that needs to be dealt with. And so what I'm saying is that under, first of all, democratic, it would represent people, not nations. Secondly, federal, there would be a distribution of powers, which means if there was a world constitution drawn up, then it would have to be ratified by all the countries of the world, and it would only give certain powers to certain agencies within this world government, so that they would only have jurisdiction to settle disputes between nations, and cases of human rights violations. They would have no authority whatsoever to tell some country what to do inside its own country in terms of what kind of an economic system it should have, or what kind of a social or political system it should have. All of those kinds of powers, or what kind of an educational system it should have. It seems to me that all of those powers should be reserved to the nations. Okay, so it wouldn't be that much of a different, we would still have different societies. We might have some capitalist societies and some socialist societies and some communist societies, but it would be up to the people in each society to decide what kind of society they wanted to have. Okay, so this is a vision, this is a suggested practical solution to this problem that we're facing. Because we hear, of course, a tremendous amount about how terrible nuclear weapons are and how bad they are and genocidal and all these things and how we've got to get rid of them. But I think it's really important to think out carefully, yeah, but what are you going to replace them with? Because there's a lot of people say, yeah, but that's what's preventing wars from happening. But as I've explained, only wars between the superpowers. It hasn't prevented the wars in the third world. So this is a suggested idea of a way of replacing the security system of deterrence with a much better one. It's better in many ways. It's better because it's fairer. It's more just for everyone. It's better because it would make the world much more prosperous, because we wouldn't be wasting so much of our resources building weapons and having these huge military establishments. We could be paying these people to do constructive things. And these kinds of constructive activities actually provide more jobs than are provided when people are working on cost-intensive defense types of expenditures. I mean, just think what we could do in education and in healthcare, not only in this country, but throughout the world. If we had more people that we could pay for teachers, and we could pay our teachers more, and we could send people around the world, and we could educate people, and we could provide the health care and the clean water and the environmental protections, and we'd have better products, we could compete better in the world market, and we could really turn this earth into a paradise. I mean, that's what I see as a possibility. Not only that, we'd have more leisure time to do cultural things, do spiritual things, to enjoy time with our friends. So we would just be better off in a lot of ways. Okay, so now we get to the difficult part of the question, I suppose you're all wondering, is how do we get from where we are now to that more ideal situation? And this is a complex question because there's so many aspects to it. But I want to talk a moment about the psychology and the philosophy of nonviolence, because it seems to me that the best way to bring about reform and change and to do this is through nonviolent methods. Now, nonviolence comes from the Sanskrit word ahimsa, which literally means not hurting or not injuring, and it's translated nonviolence. And to me, this is the basic ethic. It should be the basic principle of morality or of ethics, is whether what one is doing is harmful to another person. Other people may use other criteria, but I think that's a really basic one. I mean, nobody wants to be hurt, okay? And so if we can have personal relationships where we're not hurting anyone, we're all going to be freer and we're all going to be better off. So the process of change that uses nonviolence then is really a process of education, in the sense that it's like, I'm not going to force my solution on you. I'm not going to say, point a gun at you and say, this is the way we're going to do it here, because I hold the power. It's like, I'm going to, and in another respect, it's not I'm going to be real passive, and I'm not just going to accept what you're saying because you're holding the gun. It's something in between that. It's something that's strong and assertive, but that also recognizes the freedom and the intelligence and the understanding of the other person. So what it says is, I'm going to stand up for what is right, even if, and if I think that what you're doing is wrong, morally wrong and harmful, then I will not cooperate with that. This is the Gandhi's principle of non-cooperation with evil. And as Edmund Burke once said, the surest way for evil to triumph in the world is for the good people not to do anything. Some of you may have seen the movie Amazing Grace and Chuck. And this, I recommend it if you haven't seen it. It's set in Montana, by the way. And it's a very powerful message, because it shows the kind of spiritual power a person can have simply by saying, no. In other words, I will not go along with this because it's something deeply wrong with it and we need to change it. And I'm not going to force you to change it, but I'm not going to go along with it either until it gets changed. And so this is basically the power of nonviolence, of non-cooperation with evil. So nonviolence then works on the heart and on the conscience of the other person. It's really based on faith. It's based on faith in human nature, that the other person is reachable, that we don't have to just try to force them to do it, that it's based on faith that we can communicate with the other person and come to an understanding of what's fair and what's just. It's based on faith, essentially, that we can settle our differences without the use of force. Now, given all the problems that we have, then how can we make this kind of change through nonviolent means? Well, it seems to me we're much better off, because if we try violent means, if we throw a bomb at something as a protest, we're going to lose all our any moral credibility, because we're going to be as bad as the other people, the people who use violence. And we're going to lose sympathy for our cause. And really what we're trying to do here is we're trying to convert people. We're trying to educate people in terms of what is really right. So what we need to do is to act strongly for what is right, stand up against what is wrong, and if necessary to go to jail sometimes, or in a situation like we have in our society, we have a democratic process. Now, it may only be once every 2 or 4 years in terms of actually changing the main people in the national government, but those opportunities do come up. And this is one of the main purposes of my tour. And what I'm trying to do is to urge people and to stimulate the peace activists and the peace movement to really work to influence the next elections. I believe we have a tremendous opportunity. And it seems that the historical patterns favor the Democratic Party in terms of the presidential election. I think that I would say about 98% chance there's going to be a Democrat elected president for many reasons. Just like there was probably a 98% chance there was going to be a Republican in 80 and 84. So the situation, though, is, as many of you are probably aware, just because there's probably going to be a Democrat doesn't mean that the Democrat is going to be any more for peace or any less for military in the arms race than most of the Republicans. So it seems to me that we have this opportunity, and it's really up to us to take the lead, to show leadership, and to tell the people who are running for president and maybe the people who are considering running for president that we want them to be for peace and justice in the world, and that if they want our support, that's the positions they need to take. So on one level, the petitions that I have over here on a table can be signed or circulated and sent to the people running for president to show them that there's a lot of people around the country. Now, I'm going to 47 states, 130 cities over a period of 7 months, and the idea then is to get these petitions coming from all around the country over all this period of time so that these people will say, wow, there's really a lot of people out there who would like to see peace by the year 2000. I've written an article called Will We Make Peace in 1989? Because in that article, I describe some of the problems, and then I have a 10-year plan for disarmament. If we have a president who's in favor of, for example, nuclear weapons freeze and peace treaty in Central America, that president on January 20th, 1989, could say to the American people, we're starting a moratorium on nuclear weapons today as long as the Soviet Union goes along. And we'll have accurate verification, and if there's any suspicion of it being violated, then we could go back. But I think the Soviet Union is ready for it. Mikhail Gorbachev has put out as a goal a world without nuclear weapons by the year 2000. So we could have a freeze on nuclear weapons while we're negotiating a disarmament treaty. We could also be working very actively for a peace treaty in Central America. We could be stopping aid to the Contra-terrorists in Nicaragua. And I think also it would be good to stop military aid to El Salvador, but it probably would need to be done through a regional peace treaty so everyone's security could be protected, and then the natural democratic processes could take place. I suggest then a freeze which would then entail international inspection teams in every country that has nuclear weapons going on site and making a complete inventory of all nuclear weapons, all their delivery systems, where they are, how many, et cetera, and then starting in 1990, we could have a 5-year plan to get rid of all ballistic missiles. They're the most destabilizing. And this is one of the ideas that was actually discussed at the Reykjavik summit last October. So those could be eliminated 20% per year. And so think about the confidence that people would gain once the freeze had started and people said, hey, they're not making any more nuclear weapons, neither side. Isn't that great? Gee, maybe this will work. Maybe we can, this is in the best interests of everyone in the world. Not just us or not just them. It's really in everyone's best interest. Isn't this great that this is happening? And we go step by step, and as we go each step, people will gain more confidence with the process. The second 5 years then would be the elimination of all other nuclear weapons in every country, chemical and biological weapons, and a greatly reduction of conventional forces. The argument's always used that, well, how are you going to defend Europe against the conventional forces of the Soviet Union if we don't have any nukes? Because our policy is based on, deterrence through first use of nuclear weapons. Well, actually, if the Warsaw Pact nations have put out proposals to reduce forces on both sides, but we haven't, with the Reagan administration, gone along. It's true that the United States has fewer forces in Europe. Of course, we're way over here, and we're farther away than the Soviet Union. We have about 1 million troops. Soviet Union has 1.8 million. However, if you count Britain, France, and West Germany, there's 800,000 more. That makes it even. And then if you count the other allies on each side, again, it's about a standoff. And yet the Soviet Union also is facing China. And China has a great many more soldiers than the Soviet Union on that border. So actually, the Soviet Union is outnumbered by their enemies. So what we could do is we reduce these forces over this, and then by the year 2000, we would have a world that would be very much a safer and disarmed world, and we could be working, I would suggest, these kinds of constitutional processes in the development of international law, so that these inspection teams would be international, and they would make sure that there was no nuclear weapons left in the world. And then there would be careful monitoring, even until all nuclear power plants are gone. But for a while, there may be nuclear power plants. So there would be careful monitoring of every stage, from the mining of the uranium to the final waste and the plutonium. This would be carefully monitored. And if anyone was suspected of violating this international laws, then that person or people should be tried before the international court, and if convicted, imprisoned. So that you would have a sense of security and a sense of safety much more than we ever have today. I mean, the comparison is just staggering, because, people say, well, could you trust the Russians, We don't have to trust them. We make sure that these things are happening. We're trusting them right now not to blow us off the face of the earth. I mean, we could make one little threat, or they make one threat, and, 20 minutes, they could destroy our society easily. So, we're trusting the Russians all the time. Well, I've been talking for quite a while here, and one of the things that I would like to do is, there's so many aspects to this issue, and I've only really tried to hit some of the main points that I feel are particularly of concern. Well, I guess maybe in terms of the strategies of the peace movement, I could say a little more before I open it up to questions. You might be thinking of questions you'd like to ask or comments you'd like to make, because like I say, there's many different issues, philosophical, psychological, economic, political, anything you'd like to ask, I'll do my best to try to answer it, because I have tried to study this issue from many different perspectives. But another thing that I'd like to talk to you about is some grassroots strategy that we can work on for the next election as peace activists. I came up with this idea when I was in Eugene, Oregon. I was talking to this guy with Citizens for Action for Lasting Security named Gary Kutcher. In fact, it's quite interesting, because he told me he had a dream, and I later discovered that it's really quite a prophetic dream, and I don't think he nor I knew that at the time. But he told me he had a dream that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar gave up basketball until there was nuclear disarmament. And if you've seen that movie, you'll understand why it was prophetic, because I don't think he knew anything about the movie. Anyway, we came up with this idea. There's some people that have suggested like a national peace convention next year to really try to rally the peace movement. I was thinking about this as I was driving through the redwoods from California into Oregon. And I thought, wow, that would be a great idea. We really need to get mobilized and try to really influence this election. But then I was talking to Gary, and it just seemed like it's so difficult. I mean, even if you had it on a regional basis, it's very difficult for people to travel long distances. And then it's such a huge meeting. You know, who would speak? How would you make decisions? It would be very difficult. So then we hit upon this idea of having statewide peace conventions. And I suggested 1 month before the primary in each state. Because it seems to me that even in a large state like Montana, almost everyone who really wants to can manage to get a ride or get away to go to a city within the same state for like a conference for a weekend or something. And so the idea would be for the peace activists in each state on a grassroots level. It really would be up to the people in each city, in each state, to get together and to have this kind of a convention. And it seems to me a logical step because I've been traveling around from city to city, and it's very heartening for me to see in every city just about, there's usually an office that's been set up, and sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 or more in the larger cities, where there's usually more than one peace group operating out of that office. And so they're working together. They're sharing the same building. They have different offices. They know what each other are doing. There's pretty good networking going on in most cases. And this city is a wonderful example. I mean, look at all the people that have gotten together here tonight. It's just really an ideal situation. And so with the networking going pretty well on a citywide level, it seems to me that the next logical step would be the statewide step. Because it would be a question of having this network, you know, let's say get in touch with Missoula and with Helena, which is already going on to some extent, and could organize a statewide peace convention. So then these conventions would be really trying to make an effort to influence the elections and to get together and communicate and strategize with each other and to discuss the different candidates and to invite these people to come and to speak. The people running for president, the people running for the Senate and for the Congress, and say, what are you going to do in Central America? You know, what are you going to do about the nuclear arms race? What do you recommend in the new budget? What kind of things do you want to spend money on? What kind of things do you want to take money away from? And find out what their stands are, the issues are, and then discuss with each other, who do you think we should support? Who do you think we should work for? And I believe that, you know, there's a saying that if the people will lead, the leaders will follow. That if we show these politicians what it is we really want, you know, like President Eisenhower said, you know, someday, you know, the government people better get out of the way because the people want peace so much, they're going to have it. And so the leaders better start following what the people really want. And so I think it's really up to us because we're talking about the survival of all our descendants. So this is another idea, is to have statewide peace conventions and to work, I guess you might say, in the old-fashioned way of politics, of grassroots and door-to-door and talking to your friends and neighbors and saying, are you concerned about nuclear weapons? Or, you know, do you really like the killing that's going on in Central America? And see if we can move each other into action and not just always depend on the media. Well, maybe I could open it up for questions or comments now. Arrest the people who violate the law when you have this kind of world law. And, you know, it's like, how can you arrest a whole country? Okay. That's a good question, and it would be worked out. First of all, there does need to be this process of disarmament in order for this kind of system to work. I don't think that we could you know, have the nations armed to the teeth like they are now, and have some sort of world body with no arms at all, try to say, well, you know, the whole country is under arrest. So what we need is a process basically really of disarmament first with international treaties and international law, and then the development of a system of world law. And again, I recommend nonviolence. Now, there's other people who have put out ideas about world law and world government who have less radical or less peaceful or nonviolent means of enforcing the law. Some say, well, there should be a world army and that it should be made up of no more than 3% from any one country, and no more than 3% should be stationed in any one country and such like that. And that might possibly be an interim solution. But another is that we would have skilled people trained in nonviolent direct action or nonviolent intervention. And so the system basically would be that you have already established a kind of world unity. And so that when you had violations, you would crop them. If they cropped up, it would be at a fairly small level. Or as Baha'u'llah, the great 19th century religious teacher, suggested that if any one nation tried to attack another nation, all the other nations in the world should rise up and stop it. Okay? So we're talking about like a world unity. And if we have a process of disarmament that occurs first, then it would, these things don't happen overnight. It's like when President Reagan was talking about, Star Wars, so-called strategic defense, and saying, well, some madman might make a nuclear weapon, and how are we going to defend ourselves against that? It was a really absurd argument because, first of all, sure, maybe someone can make a nuclear weapon, but even if someone put a nuclear weapon in a suitcase and brought it in to the country, Star Wars would absolutely be, no effect on something like that. And if someone were to try to make a missile after all the missiles have been dismantled, you just don't make a missile in your basement, it's a rather complicated thing. And so, so if it's like it was something small, like where there's only a few people involved, it would be relatively easy for everyone else in the world to stop those few people from doing it. And if it was something relatively large, like a whole nation trying to do something, then the world certainly would get wind of it long before it had reached any large stage, and it would have stopped it at an early stage in its progression. Yes, and the question? The question is, the final question was would there ever be more than a small group who would engage in nonviolent action? I guess the implication being that if it was not any more than a small group, it never would be effective.
And if it is only a small group, is there still a role for nonviolence?
And if it is a small group, is there still a role for nonviolence? Okay, well, the question is, there's many comments that were raised. First of all, there's different aspects of engagement. And so that when we talk about how many people are in favor of something, it depends on what we're talking about. When we're talking about how many people are in favor of getting arrested and going to jail, it's a small number. If you talk about how many people are in favor of a nuclear weapons freeze, it's about 75%. Okay, so there's some aspects, there's some issues, there's some stages in the progression that we could move along where we have a lot of support that's there, present, and it could be institutionalized once we have leaders who are willing to do that and to follow what the people are saying. As far as nonviolent action goes, there's a small minority can be extremely effective. I'll take the civil rights movement as an example in this country. In the 1950s, we had segregation in the South, and there began to be some protests and some nonviolent civil disobedience to protest these inequities in society. Now, if you took a poll of the whole society, you probably would find something like the freeze, where you'd find probably most people in the country as a whole would say, yeah, there ought to be civil rights, there ought to be equal rights for black people as well as white people. If you took a poll in the South, of course, you probably would find there would be a minority at that time. And yet, how many people actively engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience and civil rights movement? A few hundred, probably, maybe a few thousand at the most, in a population of millions. Okay, so there's a seed, and there's a certain power in this kind of action that gets people's attention, that brings about changes. Also, there's examples of popular movements which have used not necessarily the process of getting arrested, because that's only one tactic of nonviolence, but take the example of the Philippines after the election was stolen from Aquino. You have a spontaneous situation, and people weren't even educated or taught the philosophy of nonviolence, spontaneously rising up and in groups, situation, placing themselves in a situation to actually guard the military is what they were doing. The people were guarding the army from the people who were trying to make the coup. And the only fighting that broke out was actually over the TV station. And so you had a kind of a spontaneous movement where there was a nonviolent change in the government just because the masses were moved. You have a situation in some of the Scandinavian countries. I'm thinking of Denmark and Norway, when the Nazis came in there during World War II and declared that Nazi propaganda was to be taught in the schools, was one example. I think that was in Norway. And the Norwegian teachers refused to do it. You know, and what could the Nazis do who are occupying the country? You can't make teachers teach something they don't want to teach. So there's tremendous power in non-cooperation. Another example was in Denmark, where they passed a law or made a decree that all Jews were supposed to wear a yellow star to identify themselves in Denmark during the Nazi occupation. So the king himself, as I recall, put on a yellow star, and all the people followed. Everybody put on a yellow star. And so it had absolutely no effect. So there are situations. Now, in terms of tactics, the process of civil disobedience, or you look at the situation of India, in which Mahatma Gandhi, led the Indian people, and it took a process of, 50 years to bring about their independence from the Empire of Great Britain. But they did it through nonviolent means. So it takes a lot of patience and a lot of perseverance and endurance. But they're saying that he wins who endures to the end, or she wins who endures to the end. And there's different processes, and I think that we have a chance with elections in this country to make major changes. And if people are so ill-informed and unaware of the consequences or of the issues of what's going on, there's different scenarios that can follow. One is that we'll have to learn the hard way, which might be some sort of a limited nuclear war. Some people say that can't happen. I say that it's kind of unlikely because there's the tremendous danger of escalation, but it is possible. Everything is possible. There might be a horrible nuclear accident. Nuclear power plant might be attacked by terrorists and melt down and explode and contaminate a whole state or something. There might be an economic collapse, a banking crisis, a sudden deflation. Nobody has any money, nobody can hire anybody. Half the people get thrown out of work. Maybe that's what it takes for our society to learn the lessons of what we're doing to ourselves. I believe that we can learn from our wisdom and through education and through communication, that we don't always have to put our hand on the stove to burn it to find out it's hot. If we see somebody else burn their hand, or somebody tells us if you put your hand on there it's going to burn it and it's going to hurt, then we don't have to do it. So that's basically what I'm working on. Is I think we're going to make the transition. And the only question I have is, how much suffering do we have to go through to make this transition to a new era, a new world, a spiritual renaissance? And I'm just doing what I can to make it alleviate the suffering involved in the change. Yes. Very good. Yeah, I usually say about how we need to work on ourselves spiritually in our own personal relationships and reflect that out into our larger sphere in social and political action. But I think probably all of you, maybe many of you, understand that already.
Mr. Why don't you
Yeah, did everyone hear that? I haven't heard of that before. I think it's really a neat idea. The idea is to tax defense industries so that they don't make so much profit on defense, and they have a negative tax on those industries that are constructive, that are helping our society. And I think it's a marvelous idea. These are the kind of things where we need to put our values into practice. But I think maybe it's obscene. I mean, you read in the newspaper some of these chief executives of some of these defense organizations getting bonuses of $300,000 and $400,000 a year. I mean, this is our tax money. I mean, you know, we don't realize it. Sometimes we don't put two and two together and think some of these things out. But have you ever thought about the idea that all the defense industry in this country is basically a nationalized industry? It's just like a socialist state as far as that industry goes. So we have, you know, military-industrial socialism in this country, and those people are not really in a free market. I mean, they only have one buyer, the U.S. government, basically, unless they're doing it illegally. And so we have the situation where they're making enormous profits on these things at the expense of the taxpayers. And we put up with it. I mean, we ought to be ashamed of ourselves. More announcements. I haven't talked about conversion. I think it's a really important issue here particularly because I understand there's a lot of defense business here, as there is where I'm from in Southern California. And I think it's really important that we not just turn away from this, and these people who are working in these industries, we really need to be concerned about their jobs and what they're going to need to be doing. And this is one of the things I'm calling for in my petition, is that to urge Congress to set up commissions and hold hearings and to do investigations and to study the best ways of bringing about disarmament and conversion. Now, conversion is a term that's used to describe changing over from making this military type of equipment into something constructive. Okay, and so a lot of times it may depend on a lot of retraining and re-education, but I think the more money, you know, we can put into education, the more we're going to be improving the quality of our life. And so, you know, I would be for, you know, even guaranteeing jobs to all the people that work in defense. You know, even if we're paying them to, you know, build roads or build schoolrooms or learn how to be teachers or whatever. You know, it's like we're better off paying them out almost to do nothing than to pay them to make these horrible weapons. And at the same time, if we're paying them to do something that would be helpful, you know, maybe go out and work in the national parks and build trails or whatever, like they did in the New Deal, we would be improving the quality of our life instead of just making more dangerous toys. Are there other announcements? No. Okay. Well, their taxes, and I haven't paid taxes in several years, and I keep my income, well, if I keep it that low, it just is so low, I don't really owe any taxes. If I have any money, I spend it publishing some books about peace or something. So I don't believe in paying taxes when 61% of it is going for military uses. There are two major national war tax conscience organizations in the Seattle area. They're both very good. I talked to a man in Portland who is an interesting case because it showed what the situation can be like even when it gets difficult. He and his wife decided to withhold the percentage of their taxes that they felt was going for military weapons, not personnel costs. And they made some exceptions, so it wasn't just the whole entire military budget, but they felt the things that they couldn't in good conscience contribute to, and it was maybe 45% or something like that. So they withheld that each year of their taxes. And of course this made them stand out because then the IRS knew exactly how much they were supposed to owe and how much they were actually withholding. And he is a minister, and so the situation came down that they were going to lose their house or something. So they sold their house, and they went in with these two other families into this house, which they live as a community. And so this house is shared in this community. They don't own the house. They also share their incomes. Okay? So they're in a situation, there may be someone, but I don't know of anyone who's been put in jail for refusing to pay taxes. They've threatened that, I suppose, to some people. But I think that we each in our own conscience have to decide what's the best thing that we can do personally and the best contribution that we can make for the good of the world and the survival of the human race. And I'm not anyone to tell anybody what to do, but I do try to inspire and to encourage people to do more and to do whatever they feel is the best thing that they can do. But it does seem to me to be a kind of a hypocrisy to be praying for peace and paying for war at the same time. Well, we each have to decide who we're supporting. At this stage in the game, I'm not making any absolute commitments because it's still, pretty unclear to me what a lot of the views are going to be of the candidates who are running. I haven't heard all their positions and the statements that they've made. Naturally, I incline towards Jesse Jackson among the Democrats because I think he's been very vociferous in being for real peace and justice and for drastically cutting the defense budget. And most of the people I talk to are peace activists feel the same way. But then, of course, we have a dilemma here because, as people probably realize, it would be rather unusual for a black man to be elected president, and also since he hasn't been elected to office prior to this time, even though he does have quite a lot of good experience and is a very dynamic man. So what I'm trying to do is not necessarily take a position at this time, but to try to show leadership and to influence all of the candidates to move over to where we are, to what we want, okay? And then when we get down to the time where we're going to have to decide who to support and work for or who to vote for, then we can choose the candidate that we feel strategically has the best opportunity to bring about these changes in our society. I feel that, personally, that Jesse Jackson would be an excellent vice president. And so I think we might see a kind of similar situation to what happened in 1968, although I hope it doesn't happen quite so tragically as that resulted. But as you may recall, during the middle of the Vietnam War, Eugene McCarthy came out against the war and was really not that well known. And he won the primary in New Hampshire against a sitting president who was rather popular, especially on domestic issues, Lyndon Johnson. And, of course, then Johnson decided not to run. And so, Bobby Kennedy came out against the war and then ran for president and did rather well. And if he hadn't been shot, he probably would have been nominated and very likely would have been elected because it was a very close election. But it turned out really tragically because he was killed, and Hubert Humphrey, who did get the nomination, was sort of tied to the policies of the Johnson's war. And it was very frustrating for the peace movement as a whole. And I'd like to see us, avoid that kind of a situation and to see if we can show leadership and find a candidate who has the courage to move over and show this kind of leadership to do what I think really a majority of the people want, which is a stop to the arms race and a stop to the killing in Central America, as well as a reordering of the budget and the priorities of social concerns. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure there's ways. Okay, the question is how can we find out about the voting records and the policies of these people who are running for president? Yeah, it's easier with the people who are in the Senate or the House of Representatives because they have to vote on national issues. And so SANE, for example, puts out voting records. And Coalition for a New Foreign Policy, I believe, also puts out detailed voting records of people who are in Congress. So you can look at those. Also, the national organizations will probably be doing profiles. And Gary Kutcher, one of the ideas he said that he might be able to do out in terms of leading up to these state conventions is to gather some little biographies or profiles of each of the candidates and what their views are. But I would also encourage people to write letters or to send these petitions, or both, to the candidates running for president with a letter, and I've done this myself, and saying, please let me know what your views are on these issues, okay? And really question them and find out what their stands are, if they're for the things that we want. So how do we educate our children on these ideas? Because they're really the ones that are going to be creating this new world. Well, I'm an educator myself. I did PhD work in the philosophy of education, and my new book is called Life as a Whole, Principles of Education Based on a Spiritual Philosophy of Love. And it seems to me tragic, and one of the tragic things that happening in the 1980s is how much attention and resources and human potential is taken away from education in our society and has been gone over into this military-industrial side of the economy. What we're paying teachers is really shameful, I think. And the numbers of students we have in classrooms compared to, for each teacher makes it very difficult for teachers to be effective. And so I really think we need to place a lot of attention because I can't think of a better way of spending our resources than in education in terms of improving the future quality of life. I'm in favor of like spiritual, non-sectarian kind of education, which could be in the public schools. And by spiritual, I guess I mean, that includes character development, the study of values. I don't favor vocal prayer in the schools, because I think it's spoken out loud, it's just an invitation to hypocrisy. You know, who's got the loudest prayer, or, you know, it's different than yours. But I do favor a moment of silence or meditation. I don't see anything wrong with that, because a person could just daydream if they want to. So I think the more effort we can put into education, and also I think we may want to try experiments in private education and find new ways, and even home education, parents educating their children at home up to a certain age. Well, there's a lot of ways that we teach peace. I think the first way we teach peace is we demonstrate it, that we are peaceful. We solve our conflicts in peaceful ways, through understanding, through cooperation, through listening to the other person. And if we raise our children this way, instead of just ordering them around, we come to, instead of the classical authoritarian personality, we have a democratic personality. The authoritarian personality, the way I see it, is a person who either likes to take orders or give orders. Okay, and doesn't really, is insecure with freedom. But what we need to teach people is how to be free, how to be fair to others, how to solve problems, and how to be understanding and sympathetic, compassionate to other people. And we do that by our demonstration. We do that by the situations that we set up. Maybe we don't urge them so much into competitive type things. Maybe we teach them more how to cooperate and work together with their friends instead of against them. We could have a whole lecture about that, I guess. Esther? Oh, it's definitely a growing movement. Yes, I'm a member of Educators for Social Responsibility in Ventura County, but I haven't worked real closely with the group. But it is, they are developing materials and curriculum, and it's definitely a growing thing. And then there are some states who have passed legislation to try to institute this in the statewide school systems, a nuclear age curriculum. There's a kind of a controversial and sometimes satirized a bill in California of John Vasconcellos on self-esteem in the schools, and Jesse Jackson has promoted this idea of, you know, be somebody, feel good, you know, do the right thing, learn how to make choices, and take charge of your life, and this all comes out of, you know, and there's a whole human potential movement in the new psychologies. And so I really think there's a spiritual evolution going on, a spiritual awakening, which is reaching more and more people, and it's pervading our society. And it's real gradual, so it's hard to notice it as happening, you know, overnight. But it's just a little at a time.